Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Arc panel titled Negotiating and Practicing Planning, Urban Practitioners in Dialogue. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel today. I promise you it's going to be worth your time. We have a set of very diverse and experienced urban practitioners on this panel in terms of what they work on, as well as where they work. Again, both in terms of institutional and their geographic contexts. I'll introduce the speakers before their respective presentations, but we have 3 presentations from 3 different parts of India, 1 presentation from Kenya, and 1 from Argentina. I have rechecked the order a little bit from the schedule that was shared. We'll start with 2 presentations from India, then move on to Kenya and Argentina, and then conclude with another presentation from India. One way or the other, all the presentations break away from this binary conceptualization of planning being either a technocratic process or a participatory process, which all of us want it to be, and highlight that there is a need for diverse urban practitioners to work together to achieve more meaningful and equal outcomes. Without further ado, let me introduce 3 speakers of the first presentation that looks at methods, moments, and experiences of knowledge co-production in the Maybe Dilli campaign. Malavika and Narayan works at Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, WIEGO, as a project associate with the Focal City Delhi team. She is also one of the coordinators of the Maybe Dilli campaign. Rashee Mehra is also one of the coordinators for the Maybe Dilli campaign. She has a postgraduate degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And at IHS, her work focuses on informal urban economies, urban activism, and social protection. We also have Ruchika Lall, who is a consultant with academics and research program at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. She works as a researcher on the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, NO program, on the questions of urban inequality and its relationship with urban education. Let me hand over to all of you now and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Geetika, for that. I'll just share a screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, it's good.
So Rashee, Malavika, and I have been a part of Maybe Dilli campaign since 2018, and the reflections that we share today are possible due to the collective work and the efforts by a growing coalition of more than 40 organizations and individuals. So would like to acknowledge that before we start. Maybe Dilli campaign is essentially, it's a people's campaign to envision and enable inclusive planning in Delhi. It consists of a collective of researchers, academics, planners, activists, community organizations, and NGOs in Delhi, and who are working together on the issues of housing, livelihoods, gender, and other rights. And the campaign really came together in 2018 in response to the official planning process of and the drafting of the new master plan for Delhi for 2041. So in this presentation, what we would like to ask is, what does it take for citizens to really engage with the planning process as an invited space of participation? And we also share ways in which the campaign has invented in order to expand that space of participation, and how the campaign has co-produced knowledge through different ways through the last 4 years. But to begin with, an acknowledgement of how planning is often in tension with the ground reality of informality in Indian cities, and inversely affects the lives of particular people, for example, residents of informal settlements, informal workers in exclusionary ways. A few examples: 30% of Delhi's households are in slums, but they live on only 0.6% of the total land area of the city. Another stark example of exclusionary planning is how 2% of Delhi's land is under parked cars, which is almost 3 times more than the area that is under slums. And so how does planning look at encroachment, and how does planning look at inclusion? The Delhi Development Authority in the past decade has demolished more houses than it has built. Housing rights activists have constantly highlighted how progressive plans have not included decades-old settlements on the plan, and really increased vulnerability of communities to evictions. And 90% of Delhi's workforce is informal, but plans don't really. Previous plans haven't really acknowledged that, and haven't really allocated spatial provisions for meaningful spatial provisions for work. So the first point of critique of master planning from the campaign was really about regarding the inadequacy of knowledge on the basis on which the plan is really constructed. And it was felt that there was a need to propositionally engage with the plan to address that. And here we'd like to also just point out that this was not a question of knowledge in terms of only data, but also that the issues themselves of informal work, of waste pickers, of domestic workers, of home-based workers, these are pertinent issues to planning itself. And that was also a gap that we would like to engage with. So in the past 4 years, the campaign has strategically engaged with the planning process through several ways. And I'll just flip through a few to share the diversity of methods the campaign has employed. We've had a series of sectoral and cross-sectoral meetings, community meetings. We've co-produced and co-written fact sheets and technical reports to engage with the state in dialogue with NIUA, and we've also filed objections and suggestions in the recent window period to file objections and suggestions in the draft master plan. I'll now hand it over to Malavika.
So as Ruchika mentioned, the three of us as members of the campaign, what we are trying to do today is to just step back and try to reflect on certain key points which we think would have resonance for similar coalitions or campaigns that are working in other contexts, and just try to see what has happened in the last 4 years, which has enabled us to participate in this extremely top-down exclusionary process of planning, and how the campaign has tried to really bridge this gap. So as Ruchika mentioned, from the very beginning, I think knowledge as a thing was something that was very much talked about in campaign meetings, because the group started meeting 3 years before the draft 2041 Delhi Master Plan was out for public comment. And this was a period when the planning agency itself was just beginning to do the background studies for it. And it was at this point that the campaign came together because of a certain sense of realization among a very diverse group of grassroots activists, researchers, people, community mobilizers, who are working on a very different kind of issues like housing, livelihood, gender, that the master plan is something that is affecting their work, and that within this group there is a body of knowledge that is present which needs to inform planning. But unless and until there is a concerted effort with a platform that is there at the city level that can really advocate for this kind of knowledge to become a part of planning, it will not be taken up by planners. So like Ruchika mentioned, it wasn't just to fill a gap of data, but also to try and question the way in which planning was proceeding in the city, through closed door meetings between technical experts where only government agencies are consulted. And there is no place for, a normal resident of Delhi to actually say what they want from this plan, determining, the development of the next 20 years. So it was with this aim that the campaign got formed. And over the past 4 years, there have been like one major achievement that we can see right now is that it has produced a body of knowledge that is publicly held and accessible and has contributed to public discourse before and during this process of the 2041 Delhi Master Plan being drafted. So, and this has been in the form of things like fact sheets and technical reports. And I'll just take a moment to just explain what are these. So the fact sheets are essentially 4-page documents which are written in extremely, simple language, not written in the language of the master plan, which presents the pertinent data about that particular sector or theme. For example, say, JJ resettlement colonies or waste picking, street vending. So the fact sheet actually presents what is the information that we know about that sector in Delhi? What are the key issues or challenges that are being faced by, that particular set of informal workers or residents? And what are the changes or demands which can come which can be asked for from the next master plan? And all of this was written through not a research process, but rather through conversations and meetings, which brought together a diverse set of people with different sorts of trainings. And the attempt was, Ruchika, can we go to the next slide? And one of the things that we now identify as, as something that has helped in this approach to what knowledge we have tried to include in these fact sheets and technical reports is essentially in this way to add, challenge, and reframe what are the existing provisions in the plan. So, for example, if I could just give a quick example, if our core demand or principle was to ask for more, to ask for, the right to adequate housing for all in Delhi, what are the kinds of information that we needed to present? So in this, we added the missing data point that we cannot talk about housing shortage without acknowledging the fact that at present, most of the housing need is being met by so-called unplanned informal settlements. So this is a data point that needs to be added in the formal plan. Secondly, we needed to challenge certain provisions like the resettlement policy and what kind of information can we actually present to do that. And here, the data that the resettlement flats that are there in very peripheral areas in Delhi, which have been built almost a decade ago and have still not seen any uptake because they are not viable. There is no livelihood around. So we present that data point. And finally, to also just reframe the fact that housing does not just mean the provision of shelter, but that it also has to be linked to livelihood. And this requires us to think of different models for worker housing, migrant hostels, so those sort of things that are there. And like I said, because this has come from a process which was constantly taken back to the groups that, these kind of policies are affecting, it led to a lot of intersectional demands that otherwise the formal planning would not recognize. And I think this is something that Rashee will also be talking about, so I'll hand over to her.
And Rashee, if you could take about a minute to wrap up as well.
All right. So I'm going to just, I'm going to just go directly, since we don't have time, I'm just going to go directly to addressing the question, the elephant in the room, that after doing all of this for, 3 years, how was the campaign? Were we really able to sort of speak to, authorities and those in power? So it was the National Institute of Urban Affairs and the Delhi Development Authority. So like Malavika's already said, that the NIUA was a little more open to our suggestions because we'd come in at a time when, they were still doing their background studies, they were still drafting the plan. So in hindsight, this beginning early has really sort of assisted the campaign to find a place at the NIUA's table. The DDA, of course, is another story, and has been closed. They've been closed to meet with us, to meet with the campaign, or to look at, or to really closely look at the research that we were giving, and also the mechanisms that the DDA has deployed for public engagement have been very faulty. So we only had 45 days plus another extension of 30 days for people to kind of give in their objections and suggestions. And these objections and suggestions were also could only be given online. So which again, we know is an extremely exclusionary way. A lot of people would never find space to come into these online spaces. We did facilitate a lot of this online conversation as well, but the DDA came up with a public engagement format, which was really, they would have 1,500 people for an hour-long slot to discuss housing in the city. So, really it showed how the DDA was just it was just a spectacle for them to say that, there's going to be public engagement, but they do not have their ear to the ground. Having said that, this is the last photo where we really the campaign members, especially the activists, went outside the DDA office and we protested. And we kind of said that, we would want to give in offline suggestions, which is critical. So within 2 days, we submitted about close to 20,000 suggestions to the DDA in a written format that members of the community were able to do. And really that number might not seem really large for a city of 2 crore people, but the DDA has received only 33,000 total suggestions to their master plan. So 20,000 of those came in an offline format that the campaign did, and we are now waiting for the plan to come out to continue our struggle to speak truth to power in Delhi, so that Delhi can look a little different in 2041. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruchika, Malavika, and Rashee, and really to showcase multiple ways that are required to engage citizens with the master plan, and not just putting an ad out for objections and suggestions, and also the time and commitment it takes to run such a campaign. I would request you to add the website link in the chat box as well, so that people can go through it. And also, I think we'll come back in the end, time permitting, to discuss more around the role of different actors, particularly the state, and see across the whole, I think all the presentations, I think it will come again and again. But thank you so much for such a great start. Our next presentation is by Lakhi Das, who brings insights from a very different context of urbanization, which is not the metropolitan cities like Delhi, and where we may need to rethink our approach to planning and its instruments. Lakhi is a social worker and housing rights activist in Jharkhand. Passionate about working for the rights of distressed communities in Jharkhand, she has been advocating on urban and child issues for over 25 years. And in that capacity, she liaises with various state level and central organizations on one hand, and with the communities on the other. Lakhi will speak in Hindi, and I will type the key points in the chat box in English. If there's something specific that you need clarity on, please do write in the Q&A, and we'll come back to that in the end. Lakhi दी, आपका स्क्रीन आपकी है।
सभी को जोहार। जब हम झारखंड की बात करने की शुरुआत करते हैं, तो सबसे पहले हम लोग ये देखते हैं कि हमारा जो राज्य है वो उसके जो मुख्य शहर हैं, वो शहरों की जो जमीन है वो जमीन स्टेट गवर्नमेंट की नहीं है। और इसके कारण क्या होती है कि एक बहुत बड़ी असुविधा हम स्लम वासियों को होता है। यहाँ पे क्या होता है कि जैसे जमशेदपुर जैसे सिटी की अगर हम बात करेंगे, तो यहाँ पे सारा जो लैंड है वो टाटा स्टील का है, वो पूरा शहर ही उन्हीं का है। अगर हम धनबाद की बात करें तो वो कोयला की राजधानी है, लेकिन वो कोयला खनन करने के लिए बीसीसीएल ने उसको लीज पर ले रखा है। इसी तरह से बोकारो और रांची भी है। तो जब हम लोगों ने स्ट्रगल करना स्टार्ट किया, जब हम लोगों के बीच में ये सवाल आई कि मुझे मेरे घर के लिए जमीन की लड़ाई लड़नी है, तो उस लड़ाई के लिए हम लोगों को लगा कि मेरी पहली लड़ाई होगी मेरा डिग्निटी और मेरी आइडेंटिटी की, कि मैं यहाँ पे हूँ, मुझे मेरे तरफ देखा जाए, मेरी पहचान क्या है, मुझे अपनी पहचान के लिए मेरी लड़ाई की शुरुआत होगी। और जब हम लोग आइडेंटिटी की लड़ाई करना शुरुआत किए तो देखने मिला कि जितने भी बस्तियों में लोग रहते हैं, ज्यादातर बस्तियों को सरकार अपनी मैपिंग में, अपने मैप में वेकेंट लैंड दिखलाता है, यानी इस जमीन में कोई रहता ही नहीं। इसीलिए हमने इस लड़ाई को और ज्यादा मजबूत किया। हम लोग 6 शहरों में क्या किए कि हर एक स्लम में जा जा करके, पहले तो हम जहाँ रहते हैं उस जगह को हमने सरकार का जो लोकल सेल्फ गवर्नेंस है वहां पे एप्लीकेशन दे करके उसको उनके लिस्ट में शामिल करवाएं कि हम लोग इस जगह पे रहते हैं, ये हमारा बस्ती है जिसमें हम लोग इतने परिवार के लोग रहते हैं। जिस वक्त देश में BSUP और राजीव आवास जैसी योजनाएं आई थी, उस वक्त एक जीपीएस मैपिंग चल रही थी और उस जीपीएस मैपिंग के समय हम लोगों ने मतलब अपने बस्ती के आइडेंटिटी के लिए उनके उन सारे लिस्टों में अपने बस्तियों के नाम को शामिल किया। और उसके बाद हम लोग एक बहुत अच्छा कैंपेन चला था जिसका हम लोगों ने नाम दिया था झोपड़ी से मुख्यालय, यानी हम लोग जहाँ पे रहते हैं वहां से हम मुख्यालय जाएंगे और सारे के सारे शहरों में, 6 शहरों में हम लोग एक साथ इस कैंपेन को किए थे और एक साथ लगातार 1 सप्ताह तक मुख्यालय में लोगों ने अपने मांगों को लेकर के धरना प्रदर्शन किया था कि हम अगर जीवित रहना चाहते हैं, अगर हम यहाँ पे रहना चाहते हैं तो हमें क्या क्या चीजों की जरूरत सरकार से होगी। हम लोग जिन राज्य में रहते हैं, इस झारखंड में सरकार का कोई भी स्लम डेवलपमेंट एक्ट या स्लम डेवलपमेंट पॉलिसी नहीं है। तो इससे क्या होता है कि अगर हम अर्बन प्लानिंग की बात करें तो अर्बन प्लानिंग का मतलब है कि सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ने जिन स्कीम्स को इम्प्लीमेंट करने के लिए स्टेट को भेजा है, उस स्कीम को कैसे स्टेट इम्प्लीमेंट करेगा, वही इम्प्लीमेंटेशन का जो प्रोसेस है उसको अर्बन प्लानिंग में शामिल किया जाता है। स्टेट का अपने तरफ से कोई भी भागीदारी नहीं दिखाई देती है, जिसका कारण है कि बेसिक सर्विसेज की लड़ाई भी कहीं ना कहीं मेरा लैंड राइट की लड़ाई के साथ जुड़ गया है। अगर मेरे बस्ती में पीने का पानी नहीं है तो मुझे लगता है कि ये भी मेरा अपना जो जमीन की लड़ाई है उसके साथ जुड़ा हुआ मुद्दा है। छोटी से छोटी सोशल सिक्योरिटी स्कीम के साथ जुड़ना भी मेरे लैंड राइट की इशू के साथ है। तो इसलिए हम लोगों ने डिग्निटी और आइडेंटिटी के साथ साथ बेसिक सर्विसेज और सोशल सिक्योरिटी को भी अपने लड़ाई में शामिल किया और हम हर घर तक कैसे हम योजनाओं को पहुंचाएं, उसको हम लोग शुरुआत किए। हम कभी भी सरकार से घर की मांग नहीं करते हैं कि मुझे हाउसिंग नहीं चाहिए, मुझे लैंड चाहिए। हम लोग हमेशा लैंड राइट की बात करते हैं, ना कि हाउसिंग राइट की, क्योंकि हम लोग ये कहते हैं सरकार को कि आपको आजादी के 75 साल बाद जिस घर को मुझे अब तक बना के दे देना चाहिए था, वो घर मैंने खुद बनाया है, यानी कि जो सरकार को करना था वो मैंने किया है। तो फिर मैंने जहां अपना घर बना लिया है, वो घर में मुझे रहने का राइट दीजिए आप, यानी कि मुझे लैंड राइट दीजिए, ना कि मुझे आप नया घर बना करके प्रधानमंत्री आवास योजना जैसे या इससे पहले भी जो भी स्कीम आई, वो सारा स्कीम झारखंड में फेल्योर है। कोई भी स्कीम यहाँ पे सक्सेस नहीं है, सिर्फ इसलिए कि यहाँ पे लोगों को मालिकाना हक चाहिए, लैंड राइट चाहिए। हमारे यहाँ पे जब हम लोग देखते हैं कि हम यहाँ पे एविक्शन जो है वो एक बड़ा इशू है, क्योंकि चूंकि लैंड गवर्नमेंट का भी नहीं है, तो बीच में कोई कॉर्पोरेट प्राइवेट एजेंसी या कॉर्पोरेट घराना आ जाता है, तो जब किसी बस्तियों को तोड़ने की बात आती है तो हमारी लड़ाई बहुत चैलेंजेस वाला होता है, क्योंकि हम सीधे सरकार के साथ नहीं लड़ पाते हैं, क्योंकि बीच में कॉर्पोरेट घराना रहता है। और क्या होता है कि इसके अलावे कोई पॉलिसी नहीं होने के कारण हम सेंट्रल में या देश के अन्य राज्यों में जो घटनाएं होती है, या उनकी जो लड़ाई है, या उनका जो कोर्ट लिटिगेशन केसेस की जो ऑर्डर्स है, हम उनको बेस बना करके अपने सरकार से बात करते हैं, क्योंकि हम लोगों का जो राज्य है वो हम सभी जानते हैं कि ये आदिवासी बहुल राज्य है और स्लम में मिक्स पॉपुलेशन है, लेकिन ज्यादातर आदिवासी लोग अभी भी बस्तियों में रहते हैं। तो अगर सरकार यहाँ पे और कंपनियां लगाती है तो कहीं ना कहीं जमशेदपुर जैसे या धनबाद जैसे और शहर बनेंगे, तो और अगर शहर बनेंगे तो उससे वो शहर बनने का पहले हमको कहीं ना कहीं हमको सरकार के तरफ में एक पॉलिसी निर्माण की दिशा में हम लोग बढ़ने का प्रयास कर रहे हैं कि सरकार भी एक इस दिशा में सोचे कि अगर मुझे किसी बस्ती को तोड़ना है, अगर मुझे किसी बस्ती को तोड़ने की जरूरत पड़ी तो मैं उस बस्ती के पुनर्वास को लेकर के क्या करूंगी। हम लोगों ने ये देखा कि बहुत सारे स्ट्रगल के बाद कहीं ना कहीं अब अगर नोटिस आती है बस्तियों में, बोल पाते हैं कि मेरा पहले पुनर्वास करो, उसके बाद ही आप मेरे बस्तियों को तोड़ने के लिए आओ। और हम लोग एक चीज देखे हैं कि जब हम मास्टर प्लान की बात करेंगे तो ज्यादातर हमारे जो राज्य की राजधानी है रांची, वहीं पे अभी मास्टर प्लान है। तो जब हम लोग मास्टर प्लान को देखते हैं तो बहुत खुश होते हैं कि अरे हम तो जिस बस्ती में रहते हैं वो तो रेसिडेंशियल एरिया में ही मास्टर प्लान में डाला गया है, तो शायद मेरे बस्तियों को तोड़ने की जरूरत सरकार को नहीं होगी, क्योंकि सरकार तो इसे रेसिडेंशियल एरिया में दिखला रहा है। लेकिन इस रंगों के खेल के बीच में हम लोगों ने ये पाया कि रेसिडेंशियल एरिया होने के बावजूद ये समझना पड़ेगा कि वो रेसिडेंट किसके लिए बात कर रहे हैं। क्या वो हम लोग जो लोग बस्तियों में रहते हैं उनके लिए बात कर रहे हैं, या वो लेने की बात कर रहे हैं कि वहां पे वो चाहे वो अलग अलग योजनाओं से बना दे, या किफायती आवास जैसे स्कीम्स लाए, या स्मार्ट सिटी जैसे स्कीम को वो वहां पे इम्प्लीमेंट करके बस्तियों को हटा के वो रेसिडेंशियल एरिया ही रहेगी, लेकिन वहां हम नहीं रहेंगे, वो किसी और का रेसिडेंट होगा। तो ये कहीं ना कहीं हमारी एक लड़ाई है। और हम लोग हमारा सबसे पहला जो स्ट्रगल रहा कि हम लोग जैसे बस स्टैंड ब्यूटिफिकेशन के नाम पे बस्तियों को तोड़ा गया, लेकिन वहां हम लोगों ने सरकार के साथ बहुत ज्यादा लाइजनिंग की, और अंत में हम लोग जो बुलडोजर बस्ती आ गई, वो बुलडोजर को भी हम लोगों ने 7 दिन 10 दिनों तक रोक के रखा कि पहले आप नेगोशिएट करो, पहले आप बात करो कि आप हमारे लिए क्या सोचे हो। और अंत में ये देखा गया कि पहले सरकार ने रिहेबिलिटेट किया और उसके बाद उन बस्तियों को तोड़ा गया। बाद में ये इशू आई कि जहाँ पे रिहेबिलिटेशन किया गया है वहां पे मतलब वहां पे भी कुछ मुद्दे जरूर हैं, लेकिन इसको हम लोग गवर्नमेंट का एक गुड प्रैक्टिस के रूप में देख रहे थे कि जहाँ पे कभी भी हाउसिंग की बात ही नहीं की जाती थी, जहाँ पे कभी भी स्लम की बात ही नहीं की जाती थी, वहां पे अगर स्ट्रगल का रिजल्ट ये हो कि पहले सरकार बस्ती के लोगों को बसाया है, उसके बाद उनके घरों को तोड़ा गया है, तो इसको हम लोग गुड प्रैक्टिस ही मान रहे हैं और हम लोग चाहते हैं कि आने वाले समय में ऐसे ही हो। दूसरा जो एक इशू है वो है रेलवे लैंड पे हमारे राज्य में जो बस्तियां बसी हुई है, और ये चूंकि हमारे पूरे देश का इशू है, लेकिन मैं चूंकि झारखंड की बात कर रही हूँ, तो रेलवे लैंड पे भी हम लोगों ने एक पीआईएल किया हाईकोर्ट में पिछले 3 साल पहले रांची के स्लम को लेकर के, जब वहां पे सरकार बार बार वहां पे अपना नोटिस भेज रही थी कि इस बस्ती को हटना पड़ेगा। तो हम लोगों ने फिर हाईकोर्ट में पीआईएल किया, और पीआईएल करने के बाद हम लोगों ने देखा कि हमें स्टे मिल गई, कुछ महीनों के बाद स्टे मिल गई, और कहीं ना कहीं कोर्ट ने लोकल सेल्फ गवर्नेंस से ये पूछा कि आप अगर बस्ती को तोड़ रहे हो तो आप इनके बारे में क्या प्लान किए हो। तो ये हमारे लिए एक जीत थी, और अभी भी वो बस्ती को हम लोग बचा पाए हैं। लेकिन ये कुछ सकारात्मक कहानियां हैं। इसके साथ साथ हम लोग अपने बस्ती को बचाने के लिए, अपने लैंड राइट को बचाने के लिए हम लोगों ने इस मुद्दे को एक पॉलिटिकल इशू भी बनाया कि जब भी चुनाव आई तो हम लोगों ने हम लोग इलेक्शन एडवोकेसी कैंपेन के तहत हमने इस मुद्दे को डाला कि आप हमारे लिए बात करो, आप अपने घोषणा पत्र में हमें शामिल करो। तब कहीं ना कहीं ये मुद्दा आज एक पॉलिटिकल इशू बन पाया है। उसके बाद हम लोगों ने देखा कि महिलाओं की जो भागीदारी है इस पूरे कैंपेन में, वो भागीदारी बढ़ी है। महिला और यूथ का भागीदारी बढ़ना और कैडर के रूप में उनको तैयार करना, और जितने भी एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशन है वहां पे भी जा करके हम लोग ये जो हमारा अर्बन का इशू है इसको हम लोग बात करते हैं। एक मिनट सिर्फ बोलना चाहेंगे कि जैसे जमशेदपुर और बोकारो जैसे जो शहर है, ये समझने की जरूरत है कि एक शहर जिसकी उम्र 100 साल से ज्यादा हो गया है, लेकिन उस शहर में अभी भी तीसरा वोटिंग राइट नहीं है, यानी कोई भी यूएलबी नहीं है, कोई भी चुनाव नहीं होता है यहाँ पे लोकल सेल्फ गवर्नेंस का। तो कहीं ना कहीं ये हम लोगों का एक बहुत बड़ा कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल राइट का वायलेशन होता है, और हम लोग अभी इस लड़ाई को लेकर के भी बहुत ज्यादा बातचीत कर रहे हैं, बहुत ज्यादा आगे जा रहे हैं कि हमें यहाँ पे कॉरपोरेट घराना नहीं, हमें यहाँ पे नगर निगम चाहिए, ताकि हम शायद जो डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन ऑफ पावर है वो हो, और हम अपने डेवलपमेंट के पूरे प्रोसेस में, पूरे प्लानिंग के प्रोसेस में अपनी भागीदारी को और ज्यादा निभा सकें।
थैंक यू सो मच लकी जी, बहुत ही अच्छा था। एंड बाकी सबके लिए एक बार इंग्लिश में छोटा सा रैप अप कर रही हूँ। I think Lakhi really highlighted how that, you know, there are different types of cities and the spectrum, and we can't really look at everything in the same way. So like she highlighted in the end how Bokaro and Jamshedpur still do not have the third tier of government. So there is no local government or voting rights. And so what happens to the whole decentralization agenda in that case? And other than that, I think through the sort of the entire talk, and I have made few points in the chat, she has highlighted how they have been working across the spectrum of these different modes to engage with the government and also with the corporates to sort of, put the rights of the people up front. So ranging from legal tools to advocacy to just plain protest and just staying there on the site for days and days. And it just really highlights some of the struggles that they have been undertaking, but also really highlights the diversity in the type of urban settings we have right now. Thank you so much, Lakhi. I will now actually move on to Diana in the interest of time. So we've had so far 2 presentations from India, but bringing in insights from other parts of the global South. We first have Diana Wachira speaking about participatory adaptive planning approaches in Kenya. She is an urban and regional planner with a bachelor's degree from the University of Nairobi. She's a social justice champion and a longtime enthusiast and practitioner of human rights-based adaptive planning approaches that promote dignified, inclusive, sustainable urban communities. Ms. Wachira has a strong technical expertise in research and policy work around land and urban governance, with a particular focus on women and land. Ms. Wachira currently works at Pamoja Trust and leads the action research department that implements the research strategy of the organization. Over to you, Diana. Sorry, we're not able to hear. I don't know if it's only me. Not able to hear you, Diana. No. Should we go to the next one and then come back to you? Could anybody else jump in if they are able to hear Diana?
No, we can't hear.
No, right? Okay, cool. Diana, if you could stop sharing right now, and then maybe I'll ask Rosario to share first and then come back to you. I hope that's okay, Rosario.
Yeah, it's okay for me.
All right. Okay. Okay. So we'll go with Rosario then, who is a candidate for a master's degree in urban social policies from the Tres de Febrero University. Please repeat that, Rosario, if that's incorrect. She has a degree in sociology from the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Buenos Aires. She coordinates the Right to the City program of the Civil Association for Equality and Justice, ACIJ, the experience of which she'll share today, both pre and during the pandemic. Rosario is also a researcher in urban studies at the Faculty of Architecture, Design and Urbanism. She teaches at the General Sarmiento National University and is part of the Common Cities Initiative. I'll put your slide up, Rosario, while you get started.
Thank you so much, Geetika, for the invitation and for to pass my presentation. As Geetika already said, my name is Rosario and I work on the Civil Association for Right and Justice. That is one of the largest non-government organizations in my country, in Argentina. And we work to improve the conditions in which the most disadvantaged communities live. And one of those communities which we work with is people living in slums, as many of the people on this panel. So if you want to go to the next slide, Geetika. I don't know if you can, okay. So in Buenos Aires, nearly 10% of the city population live in informal settlements, as we call villas. We call villas to slums and informal settlements. And these villas or slums or informal settlements are deprived, as you already know, because it's something that unluckily repeated on our different countries, but villas are deprived of basic benefits and rights, such as housing, formal work, education, regular access to potable water or electricity, and even ground possession and public areas. And in these spaces, there is a necessity for a collective effort for issues that in the rest of the city are resolved by the state. This means that the self-management of their habitat really exists. And this also means that inhabitants are seen as active agents, able to formulate their life projects, and not only as passive agents, recipients of public benefits. And the existing of legislation that recognize human rights and equitable conditions of habitability and opportunities to inhabitants of segregated areas has helped, among with other circumstances, to create conditions for the development of a strong community tie and high levels of social organization and mobilization. But the gap between the formal recognition and what actually happened, I mean that the policies that the government implements, has opened many spaces for advocacy by a variety of actors. And with different approaches and objectives and strategies and tools, these actors, like us, have been increasingly engaged in initiatives that aim at reversing these kind of problems that slums lives. I mean, grassroots organizations and NGOs like ours have taken a leading role in delivering multiple strategies, some of which focus on facilitating legal resources for the communities, so they become aware of their rights and are in a better condition to carry out actions with available tools to exercise them. And as an instrument to enforce the realization of rights and to further reverse social spatial segregation, legal empowerment in particular, these legal empowerment strategies coexist with other key legal tools also aimed to facilitating and to promoting access to justice. I mean, like legal sponsorship or mechanism to claim before the public institutions, or to the promotion of collective litigations and the advocacy towards administrative or judicial public defense policies. And in Buenos Aires in particular, there is a robust legal framework, significantly strengthened thanks to an historical territorial mobilization that has been supported by legal advocates. And this has resulted in a significant number of lawsuits for accessing to public services and infrastructure, and in the adoption of local legislation that recognize and enhance the right to habitat, or the right to the city, as we call it also. And these elements have laid to the foundation to an extend use of legal empowerment tools in informal settlements. And when I'm talking about legal empowerment, I mean, what I like to say is that it's a right-based methodology that centers people in their own fight for justice and creates opportunities to people to know to use and to shape the laws that impacts in their lives. So institutions regularly empower formal experts, such as lawyers, academics, or policymakers, to make decisions that impact on human rights for the communities without a meaningful participation of the communities. So legal empowerment strives for a different word, one in which power structures are contested and disrupted and directly impact people become the authors of their own justice and their own liberation. And proponents of this approach believe that those closest to a problem are closest to the solution, and recognize that lived experience are essential expertise. So the different strategies to avoid legal empowerment and access to justice can be synthesized in three different strategies: into know, to use, and to transform our rights and the laws. When I'm talking about knowing the laws and our social rights, I'm talking about the generation of knowledge and to generate awareness about the rights that are guaranteed by our legal system and the enforcement mechanism that the community have. When I'm talking about using the law or our social rights, I mean to demand, to claim, or to defend through administrative claims or accessing to public information requests or prosecution of collective or strategy lawsuits. And when I'm talking about to transform the law, the third strategy, thank you, Geetika. When I'm talking about to change the law or to transform the law, I'm talking about to promote new laws that respond to the demands of popular neighborhoods. So please, the next one. At ACIJ, we implement these three strategies of legal empowerment and develop different actions so that the inhabitants of informal settlements can know, use, and transform the law. And we provide legal advice to the communities and design together legal strategies in the most crowded slums of Buenos Aires and the metropolitan area. Just to give you some examples of what we do, we coordinate the Latin American Node for the Global Legal Empowerment Network, and we promote the declaration of Villa Inflamable for access to justice for all and legal empowerment. We organized the International Congress of Rights and Community, and since 2014 we have been running the Community Legal Action Center in Villa Inflamable, that is a shantytown in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. But please, the next one. In this particular case, I would like to talk about a strategy that we develop so that communities can be aware of their rights. I mean, it's a strategy focused on to know our rights. I mean, on the first strategy of the legal empowerment. And in this case of the Legal Empowerment School for Leaders of Informal Settlements, the goals that we put to ourselves, the goals of this experience were to empower and to provide slums inhabitants and activists with information on rights and advocacy tools to demand the respects of their rights before their government, and to reinforce the training of professionals in accompanying informal neighborhoods to improve their environment and to support the construction of a suitable habitat. So the next one, please. So in 2019, together with the University of Buenos Aires, we developed a course for leaders of informal settlements that were taught in the university classrooms. And during 13 classes, and we had 13 classes, and more than 40 leaders learn about human rights, urban planning, social rights, and also learn various advocacy strategies. And after this course, they were able to use that knowledge in spaces of dialogue with the government, and they improved the conditions of negotiation and listening. And these leaders today use, for example, budgetary information and technical and legal language to claim rights in the spaces of participation with the local government. The next one, please. In 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic brought new challenge, of course, and they had to be addressed in terms of legal empowerment. On the one hand, some violations on rights were suffering turned worst. And on the other hand, the emergency required another type of approach to reach more people through online communications, since we were not able to work in the slums or in the villas, as we call it. This is why we generate toolboxes so that leaders can distribute the legal information to the whole population through WhatsApps, for example, such as videos, flyers, and live classes, where they could solve questions related with the disease prevention, criminal and social rights during the lockdown, and how to access social benefits in this delicate situation. And with that, we understood that we had to adapt our content to the context, and that the empowerment is only useful if it responds to the needs of the community. And please, in the next one. Our last example, in the same spirit, that in 2020, during 2021, we used digital tools to reach even more neighbors, and thus we launched a training program on rights nationwide, and we had representatives from more than 8 regions of the country, and we were challenged to address these problems in a comprehensive manner, and considering the geographical difference and the different realities and problems of this informal settlements in our country. Internet access was also a huge challenge. So we seek to generate audiovisual material that does not require being connected to the internet at a particular time, such as classes. And in this sense, the participants, although they would choose to participate in live classes, they had the classes and materials available in various ways to access them when they could. And the last one, and conclusion, in all this experience, the conclusion that we reach is that when vulnerable groups appropriate legal strategies, they become a valuable defense weapon to enforce current laws, and also to change or to generate new legal frameworks and public policies that reverse these problems that they face. So community legal empowerment involves the process of developing action strategies, building and strengthening legal capacities, which improve the conditions and the resources of vulnerable communities to act and to decide for themselves. And in this methodology, the community assumes a leading role on unleashing processes in which legal resources are combined with different modalities of collective actions, which in turn involves multiples and diverse actors, and aim to make structurally violated rights effective. And we have been doing this for more than 15 years, and we have been observing how the capacity of the communities have been strained to push for a significant change in their lives. So I'm sorry for the time that it took me. I know that I passed a few minutes, but thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for trying to understand me with my accent. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosario, and no worries about the time. We have woken you up at like 7 a.m. and it's only like a little past 8 right now, so it's only fair. And thank you. And once again, I think you're trying to break down that how what we perceive as people's tools are not just limited to that, like people are also like now expanding their skill set to sort of acquire these legal tools and then using it for like how you said, know, learn, and transform. So that's really exciting to hear. And the kind of opportunities of course, challenges as well that you saw during the COVID. So that I think is really useful to also mention. Thank you so much, Rosario. Diana, do we have you? Diana? You are on mute if you are speaking from either of the devices.
Hi,
Yeah.
hi, Geetika.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Am I
Success.
audible now?
Yes, wonderful. All right.
Okay.
The
Sorry.
floor
So
is
I'm
yours.
using my okay.
No worries.
So I'm going to share
Maybe better to turn the
my
video
screen.
off, Diana.
So
Might be better to turn the video off. It's lagging a little. Or move to a better connected spot. You're on mute again. Sorry. Diana, you're on mute again.
oh gosh. Okay.
Yes, now it's perfect. Let's go.
Okay. So let me share my screen now. I'll just switch off my camera just to ensure that I am connected throughout the whole session. Okay, so there we go. So my name is Diana Wachira. I work with Pamoja Trust, which is a non-governmental organization in Nairobi, Kenya. And we work across the country, across about 15 counties. So today I'll share lessons from the adaptive planning approach, which we have been implementing and working with communities in different informal settlements in terms of how to balance power between communities and governments, and especially vulnerable, marginalized communities in informal settlements. So I started my presentation by a premise that informal settlements in Kenya have often borne the brunt of conventional planning practices that have long been exclusionary. So effects of these exclusionary forces have been widening inequality between communities, informal and formal communities, ever-present threats of evictions. So we do have a lot of patterns of evictions targeted at informal settlements, poor social service delivery, as well as economic exclusion. So because of these instances and these circumstances, for a long time, informal settlement dwellers in Kenya have not been able to be active and effective citizens in social processes, in political processes, and economic processes. So these vulnerable urban communities have then been forced to adapt to survive within complex and vibrant spaces in a challenging urban environment. And this is what the adaptive planning processes is about, trying to understand what are these adaptive spaces, what are these adaptive forces that communities have adopted, and how can we use this as a foundation of inclusionary planning? Okay, so just a short introduction to adaptive planning. It's that it has emerged as an alternative planning approach that navigates conventional planning barriers and promotes the adaptability of settlements to influence community vision, shape development strategies, and build sustainable communities. So it seeks to understand how communities adapt to certain situations and how those adaptations can influence development strategies, shape community vision, and in this way, build sustainable communities. My next slide looks into the rationale in terms of how do we understand the adaptive planning processes. So informal spaces, as we know, exist in very complex, vibrant spaces that in one way or another, politically, economically, socially, present certain challenges and certain opportunities to its inhabitants. So informal settlement dwellers have adopted or have a system of operation and coping that enables them to survive within these spaces. So adaptive planning seeks to understand this logic. It asks the question, what is the logic that exists within this adaptive or within these urban spaces, and how can this logic be integrated within planning rationale to ensure spatial equality for all? So it not only recognizes this logic, but it also recognizes the actors that play certain roles within this ecosystem of urban inequalities in the informal settlements. So this logic bears or becomes the foundation of understanding the adaptiveness of informal settlements. So how is it that they exist, and how can this form of existence that they have be integrated within planning processes? So then this is basically a continuation of the rationale in terms of how urban communities are able to respond to urban challenges, how they're able to survive, and how they're able to thrive. Because we understand within these informal urban spaces, there's a vibrant informal urban economy. So just trying to see then by the virtue of these informal communities thriving and surviving within these spaces, how can this be taken into context within the conventional planning rationale? So then this has ensured practical and workable solutions to challenges, and has also provided a platform for identification and prioritization of settlement needs by the community in an incremental manner as part of that conversation of adaptiveness. So just as key lessons from how or from what Pamoja Trust has been doing in terms of engaging informal communities is that adaptive planning processes have facilitated social processes and models that allows for the integration of socio-ecological systems of informal spaces. So then through or because of the shortcomings of the conventional planning processes, the social processes were always not given enough weight as they should have. So then adaptive planning processes brings on board the strength of social processes that enable communities to develop workable solutions with different experts and stakeholders, in this case, planners, architects, and what have you. So it appreciates that for communities to be involved or for inclusionary planning to be really become strong, then there has to be appreciation of the importance of the social processes within community. Essentially, the adaptive planning processes shifts planning power to communities, where planning now not only becomes about building and structures, but it looks at human experiences. It appreciates the role of people, the role of community, and it also appreciates social spatial interactions. So then how do people and the spaces they live in interact, and how does that become a foundation of planning? So then power becomes, or the process then is driven by the people in that way. So another thing, as I also try to expound on the adaptive planning and the lessons learned, is that adaptive planning has become a very strong process that promotes the interrelationship and the integration of formal and informal structures of governance and planning. So communities are able to use evidence to bargain and negotiate for their spaces. And how do I mean? The first thing that the adaptive planning processes takes into consideration is that it's able to evaluate, contextualize, and operationalize existing evidence, telling us a story of what is happening at the community level, what evidence is presenting itself, and how can this be used to inform planning in one way or another. The other thing is that through this evidence, then there are strategies that can be developed on an adaptive planning approach. So then how does the evidence from communities enable communities and experts as well to develop these strategies? And then the other thing is how then these strategies can be linked to a broader context and practice. So what we have been doing, especially at the community scale, is trying to link community aspirations or community development agenda to the community processes at the county, which is the meso level, and the macro level processes. So this matrix just gives an understanding of how that interrelationship and integration of formal and formal structures comes into place, where communities are able to negotiate and they're able to bargain for their spaces based on evidence generated at the community level. So then this is just an illustration of what we mean, or what we have been using, or what communities have been using ASPM, which is the Adaptive Settlement Planning Model for, where we have that it's a tool for informal settlements communities to project their developmental aspirations. So this is what I was talking about, that how can the evidence generated at the community level be transformed into developmental agenda that will be used to influence the urban regime at the meso and the macro level. So a lot of co-production, a lot of engagement, a lot of negotiation at that level. And that is one of the key lessons from practice of the adaptive settlement planning level. Processes, sorry. As I'm concluding, I also wanted to share that in terms of adaptivity and adaptiveness and planning, adaptive planning promotes adaptive planning regulations. So we're looking at revision of urban standards that scale from regulatory controls to tenure arrangements. The photo on my right is of, on my left, sorry, is of a lady who got a certificate of recognition on her occupancy rights within Mombasa. So it provides for adaptive planning regulations, adaptive tenure acknowledgement, that tenure is not only formal and informal, that there are other aspects within that. So my last slide, which is my concluding slide, is just a summary of the different aspects that adaptive planning brings on board. One is that we have people as assets, that those who use services are equal partners to those who design and deliver them. The second one builds on people's existing capabilities. How do we integrate social capital and engage communities within these processes? We look at mutuality and reciprocity between people and professionals. What is the balance, and how do we ensure that communities also have the ownership of the process, and that they also feel that they have power within these processes? We have people as active agents of change, and also professionals facilitating processes rather than just providing instant solutions. So how can professionals, how can experts, how can planners facilitate these processes that are able to bring on board these workable and practical solutions? So that is my presentation. Thank you, Geetika, and apologies for the challenges we had at the beginning. Thank you.
All is well that ends well. I'm so glad that you were able to present finally, actually. And really interesting. I think really appreciate the idea of logics that you brought in, and like paying attention to those at all levels. And in some way or the other, I think it also links with what the next speaker is going to speak about, though changing gears completely. I think she'll refer more to the business logics, but I think the central principle of logics remain the same, and where you sort of start focusing on it. So last but not the least, we have Champaka, who will share her insights from being an integral part of the preparation of Mumbai Development Plan, and then closely watching all the controversies around it. Champaka Rajagopal is an urban planner. She is an experiential learner and a reflective practitioner. Her work includes urban planning and infrastructure governance, with an explicit focus on policy and regulatory innovation and risk. She co-led the development plan for Greater Mumbai between 2010 and 2015, and will share those reflections. Over to you, Champaka.
Thank you, Geetika. Were you saying the developers plan for Greater Mumbai?
Almost.
Way to start this presentation, I suppose. But thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel. As Geetika mentioned, I'm going to be sharing my experience and reflections from having worked on the development plan for Greater Mumbai for over 4 years. My co-panelists have shared their emphasis on the nature of state-society relationships and urban planning. And rather than focusing on state-society relationships, I'm going to focus on a different type of relationship, which has not been discussed so far, or it's been discussed very frugally in both in scholarly as well as practice domains in the context of urban planning in India. My focus is on relationships between business cycles of firms that are part of entangled markets and urban planning processes. My colleague Malini Krishnankutty has authored an important paper on the orphaned plan for Greater Mumbai. Other colleagues, Dr. Lorraine Kennedy, Dr. Ashi Masood, they've examined state business alliances for special economic zones, for instance, and industrial townships at a macro level of policy. Drawing on these, on their work, I am extrapolating some of these understandings of state business alliances into a micro level of master planning processes. I go deeper to identify a specific micro level gap in the understanding of how business cycles of firms are intrinsically linked with planning regulation. Mumbai's draft development plan 2034, of which I was an important team member, I was co-leading the plan. It took 4 intensive years to prepare. It was published for public suggestions and comments by the state governments, and 4 days after it was published, the plan was scrapped. Of course, this came as a major jolt to all of us who were working on this plan, because we were under the impression that we were working towards ushering long pending corrections to distorted land markets. At the heart of failure of this DP 2034 is regulatory capture by perverse markets, as we will see in this presentation. Implicit in this regulatory capture is the state's willful promotion of selective businesses. Regulatory capture then cannot be seen simplistically as state or market failure. We need to understand institutional relationships here. It's not just state-market relationships, but of business cycles and planning regulation. And I'll explain why it's important to look at business cycles of particular firms as well. I have discussed in the past the development plan for Greater Mumbai through more traditional framings, such as unpacking its regulatory regimes as a state of exceptions, which is very important and relevant. The lens I adopt today is that of endogenous innovation and the state's role in facilitating perverse manifestations of this demand for endogenous perverse regulatory innovations that have been part of Greater Mumbai's previous plans. Now, endogenous innovation is qualified by many characteristics, but 3 that I'm going to be discussing here. One, that within innovation systems, in endogenous innovation stems from within the system. It's a context-specific innovation that takes place. 2, innovations are endemic to endemic to innovation is the problem of coordination. There is deep-rooted coordination in some cases, and there's separation of communication and knowledge production in some other cases. And the third is relationships shaped by the process of innovation. Third is that these relationships between businesses and states, businesses and civil society organizations, much less, but states and civil society organizations, all of these different relationships may work or may not work towards accomplishment of economic equilibrium, particularly relationships between firms within markets and relationships between firms within markets and states at different levels of disaggregation, national, state, as well as local governments. These relationships may not necessarily work towards building equilibrium in terms of economic aspects. For example, market relationships may lead to fair or distorted pricing of land and property, which is a crucial parameter in urban planning. The role of the state here becomes critical to usher equal access through redistribution, whether it's about balancing out uneven development or skewed property markets, etc., for example. And master plans or development plans and development control regulations are significant planning tools that the state uses to meet its goals towards bringing about this equilibrium and to make sure that there are no distortions in the pricing for land and properties that are part of cities. And these become important aspects for allocation of resources across different parts of the cities, given that our cities are made up of very diverse kinds of urban fabrics. What I seek to do today is to situate development regulations for Mumbai in the context of innovation and state intervention, and see where state business and state civil society relationships were embedded or disembedded, and what the outcomes are. And this point about embedding and disembedding is important because it is related to the problem of coordination. Our plan was preceded by the Development Plan 1991, which over the course of 20 years of its implementation had accrued a host of distorted regulations institutionalized through opaque state business alliances. For example, the DCRs, or the Development Control Regulations of the Development Plan 91, was premised on decongestion. The fear of congestion goes back 100 years to the epidemic plague, which affected most cities in India. The DP 91 adopted a restrictive regime for allocation of development rights through the use of this particular instrument called Floor Space Index. Floor Space Index is basically a tool to measure the extent of built-up area on a building or at a block level and in different parts of the city. Now, in Greater Mumbai, the development plan for 1991 allocated a restrictive FSI of 1.33 in the southern part, which is the Island City District, and 1 FSI for the district to the north, which is the suburbs. Now, what was the issue with this allocation of FSIs, which were highly restricted? The issue is that there were many localities within or urban fabrics or different kinds of places within Greater Mumbai, which had already consumed much higher FSIs than 1.33 or 1. So this is the older bazaar fabrics, the business district, some apartment complexes, and essentially all of these parcels were unable now to tear down their buildings and go through a natural process of urban renewal. So this development plan had a plan period of 20 years. Restrictions to FSI meant that none of these properties could basically, property markets in most parts of Mumbai would not be able to ply within healthy regulatory spaces. There was no buoyancy in the development control regulations of the DP 1991. So what happened was that over a period of 20 years, there are a series of exceptions that have been built into the development control regulations. Now, it's important for us to read into each of these amendments because it helps us understand the nature of demand or lobbies involved in influencing these amendments, all of these 25 odd amendments which were built over 20 years. So let's take a look at 33.4 over here, right at the bottom, for instance. It says building of starred category residential hotels. What this tells us is the FSI exemption was provided here based on it was prorated against the star category. So depending on the category of the star hotel, there were incentives provided for additional consumption of FSI over and above 1.33. And why this particular point is important? Because these regulations then impact specific businesses. This is one example of a hotel. And each of these regulations actually go down to the micro level of impacting businesses of each of these hotels that are consuming much higher levels of FSI. This series of other amendments were similarly built, and we're not going to get into the details of all of these, but each of these regulatory amendments represent one particular kind of selective market that was able to exercise its agency and reach to the state government as well as the local governments. The second instrument that the development plan for 1991 adopted was transferable development rights. Now, one of the key functions of the development plan is to make land available for public purpose, all types of civic amenities, because it's the obligatory function of the municipal corporation. Now, faced with paucity of funds to implement public amenities for about 10 million people, the DP 1991 adopted TDR as a regulatory innovation. TDR generated on a parcel reserved for public purpose could be sold at market price dynamically anywhere to its north in the suburbs in the case of Greater Mumbai. Now, here again, the outcomes are contentious. over 20 years, TDR naturally got concentrated along the western suburbs, along the Arabian Sea and its waterfronts. That's because the consumption of TDR allows, the system is as follows, or the mechanism as follows. TDR certificate is generated, for example, in any of these parcels demarcated as red, and it can be sold anywhere to the north in a dynamic way at market prices. So that's the incentive which is built into the consumption of TDR as a regulatory innovation. Now, what that did is all of the TDR that was generated basically has got consumed largely along the western suburbs, and property prices along the western suburbs also reflect this skewed consumption of FSI in the form of TDR, all largely focused on the western suburbs. There are two reasons here. One is that the railway line that connects Mumbai to Surat also links a whole range of other industries. It also links Mumbai to Surat, which is the diamond bourse of this country, of India. So this is a very lucrative corridor by itself. And there's, of course, the Arabian Sea and lucrative waterfronts, which many five-star hotels, for instance, which are all located here in Bandra and to the north of Bandra, they all sort of cluster around this particular area here. Now, what we observed through this process—
Champaka for jumping in, but yeah.
Sure. Now, the problem is what we did was to bring corrective measures to this uneven sort of development that Mumbai has experienced through its earlier development plans. We increased the allocation of FSI. Every single building could consume more FSI than what was already existing in order to allow a natural process of urban renewal. TDR consumption was pegged with property prices, so that any parcel which had lower property prices were now also were allowed to consume much higher FSIs. That means there would be a balancing out of property prices across eastern and western suburbs. We also anticipated that there's a substantial apprehension that the public in Mumbai would have towards intensification of development and higher densities of people. So we built very sophisticated regression analysis to communicate to people that it's not a linear relationship between FSI and density, that there are places with high density, high FSI, low density, high FSI, high density, low FSI, all kinds of combinations were possible. Now, what we essentially were trying to do was to shift the existing paradigm from an endogenous condition of the regulatory space that exists in Mumbai to bring about an equilibrium in the property markets. Now, all of this sophisticated analysis that we came up with was not evident to civil society organizations. When this plan was published, they came up with this huge campaign called Dump the DP. And within a span of 4 weeks, actually, I was exaggerating when I said 4 days, but the plan was dumped. And what this essentially brought about is a series of reflections ever since on how it's important for us to think about to reflect on the major gaps that exist in expertise and the limits to rationality that exist in the space of civil society. What we are confronted with here is a situation where civil society organizations misread a well-intentioned plan, and the campaign actually resulted in dumping the development plan. And years later, now when the plan has been revised by the government, they've actually said, some civil society organization representatives came back and told us that we didn't understand what you were trying to do. So I'll stop over here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Champaka. And really, I think through the even though this sort of was from a very different perspective, but I think across the board we have seen that we really need to, all of us really need to collaborate and engage with each other to better understand how plans work, or how planning can be made better, or how different logics operate. And we usually miss this, but thank you for highlighting that there is a clear need for planners and civil society organizations to understand the business cycles of the firms, which even though we think of them as just market and and just put them on the side, but they really do play an important role, and how they are and what they are made up of. So we can't really work in silos. Thank you so much for bringing that Up. Okay, I have taken a 5-minute extension, so we have about 15 minutes for discussion. There are a couple of questions. Maybe we could start with that. And I had one question, which then maybe all of you could comment on in the end. So I think a couple of people have answered in the chat itself, so thank you so much. But if there are still any questions that you would like answer on, please retype again. But this question is for Lakhi Di. Lakhi Di, रोहित का question है कि जब आप लैंड राइट्स के लिए लड़ रहे हैं तो क्या आप बेसिक सर्विसेज के लिए, जैसे पानी बिजली है, उसके लिए भी लड़ रहे हैं, जैसे कि पानी हक समिति है बॉम्बे में? और मैं दूसरा सवाल भी पढ़ देती हूँ आपके लिए, आप दोनों एक साथ दे दीजिएगा। दूसरा सवाल है, उसने अपना नाम नहीं लिखा है, बोकारो में आपका क्या अनुभव रहा? जमशेदपुर में बस्ती विकास समिति सक्रिय रही है, मगर बोकारो में बस्ती को स्टील प्लांट ने अनदेखा सा कर दिया है। लखी दी, अगर आप इन दोनों सवालों के जवाब दे पाए।
हाँ बिल्कुल। जहाँ तक बेसिक सर्विसेज का है वो काफी स्ट्रगल रहा है, जैसे लैंड राइट का स्ट्रगल है, शायद बेसिक सर्विसेज की लड़ाई उससे ज्यादा कठिन थी हमारे लिए शुरुआती दौर में। लेकिन अभी क्या है कि पानी का प्राइवेटाइजेशन हो गया है पूरे शहरों में। कोई जैसे जमशेदपुर में जुस्को का पानी सप्लाई हो रहा है, तो अब क्या है कि बस्तियों में घर घर मतलब नल तो आ गया, लेकिन उसमें मीटर लगा दी गई है। तो वो एक अलग परिप्रेक्ष्य है। हमें बेसिक सर्विसेज तो मिल रहा है, लेकिन उसका जो मैं बता रही थी ना कि अगर चुनाव होता नगर निगम का तो हम शायद सरकार से पानी की डिमांड करते ना, वैसे अब प्राइवेट सिटी है तो वो पानी का प्राइवेटाइजेशन हो गया। अब और क्या होता है, छोटे शहरों की जो सरकार होती है ना यूएलबी की, वो बड़े शहरों के का डेवलपमेंट को देख के उनको लगता है कि मुझे रांची को सिंगापुर बना देना है, मुझे जमशेदपुर को स्विट्जरलैंड बना देना है। अब क्या होता है कि मान लीजिए 24/7 का अगर इलेक्ट्रिसिटी और वाटर की बात हो रही हो, तो फिर उसमें वो तो प्राइवेटाइजेशन होगा ही होगा। तो वो एक वैचारिक लड़ाई हम लोगों की है, लेकिन एक बहुत स्ट्रगल तो रहा है उसमें। पर अभी बेसिक सर्विसेज में हम लोग बहुत सक्सेस भी हुए हैं, क्योंकि पहले जो जनप्रतिनिधि का जो डेवलपमेंट का फंड होता था वो बेसिक सर्विसेज में कम खर्च होती थी स्लम्स में, लेकिन अब वो होने लगा है। वो संघर्ष का ही एक नतीजा है। चूंकि अब वो होने लगा है तो हम जब डिमांड देते हैं तो उससे हमको मिल जा रहा है। अब बोकारो में बात है, बोकारो अपने आप में एक यूनिक शहर है। देखिए जमशेदपुर का जमीन लैंड जो है वो लीज का है, लेकिन बोकारो स्टील ने वो शहर का लैंड को खरीद लिया है। अब क्या हो रहा है, खरीदना मतलब वो एक बड़ा मालिक है, वो जमींदार है वहां का, जिसके कारण वहां पे उसी का कानून चलता है। तो वहां बहुत स्ट्रगल है और हम लोग भी बहुत सक्सेस वहां पे नहीं हुए थे। लेकिन एविक्शन के बाद वहां का जो स्ट्रगल था बस्ती वासियों का, वो काफी सराहनीय था। लोगों ने अपना जनता कर्फ्यू वगैरह लगाया था, लेकिन अभी कुछ वर्षों से थोड़ी सी धीमी गति तो वहां पे आई है।
Thank you so much. Champaka, do you want to respond live to that question?
Sure. I have responded to Dr. Kennedy's comment. Indeed, that's an important point to think about and also pay keen attention to what kinds of, whether municipal governments and planning authorities craft innovations, process innovations. As I've mentioned in my comment as well, we came up with a whole series of technical innovations, which were then communicated all the way down to ward levels. We did 2 entire series of public workshops, but I realized these workshops are of no significance because there is no provision in the planning legislation to actually allow for a reciprocal system of communication. To respond to Rohit Lahoti's question as well, yes, we did. We reached out to civil society at 2 points in time along the process, as I mentioned, through ward level workshops and at higher macro level workshops as well. But I think the bigger concern here is that we as planners, as technical experts, are not trained to speak in simple language. We are not trained to communicate sophisticated regression graphs and radar graphs, etc., to common people in simple language. That's another major gap that exists. So I think it's a two-way problem. There's state business alliances which are not understood by many technical experts as well. And it's important to actually penetrate that space more deeply, but at the same time, experts have to be able to communicate all of that understanding in simple language to everyone. And to be also able to negotiate. We're not trained to negotiate and sit across the table with powerful people and say, now let's see how you can build compromises in public interest. I think that's a skill that we really need to develop in practice.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think I'll pose one last question if all the speakers could respond to it, like taking a minute for your final responses. I just wanted to we've heard like so many good practices, so to say, or like experiences where there has been some progress, where they are halfway through and like still seeing what kind of progress is going to be there. But I wanted to ask, how do you foresee the sustenance, so to say, and scaling up of these experiences? And connected to that question is the potential role of different actors in making this possible. And I connect to some of the questions that are in the Q&A as well, like academic institutions or the state, or, so how do you foresee some of the potentials, or where do you see the challenges that could be there in taking this forward? Maybe we could go in the order we had done the presentations. Ruchika, Rashee, Malavika, if you can go first.
I can start, and Rashee, Malavika, please. I think a huge question is of capacities of planning and those who are trained in urban practice to, as Champaka was saying, right, to engage in a dialogue with communities, to also think about how to negotiate. So I think the capacity of to practice planning as a contested practice. I think in today's presentation, it was really interesting that we had conversations about contestations and legal rights on a presentation on planning. And I think that as long as we keep thinking of planning as something that is, you plan and then we don't think about what happens after the plan is passed, but to understand that contestations are inherent to the process, and planners in that training, how do we think of that? And I think reflecting from the campaign, I think in terms of outcomes and scaling up and things like that, I think the fact that like what happens in this plan we may or may not know, but I think the fact that this has been a collective sort of effort, I am extremely hopeful, at least now, for the next 20 years, because I think that we have experienced what it has been to build capacity internally. And so there is some positivity there. But Rashee, Malavika, if you'd like to share as well.
I just want to add two things very quickly to what Ruchika said. I think one thing that we in MBD, I think one of the things we've tried to stay true to is that when we go to the communities or in our public meetings, the idea was not so much that we are trying to say what is in the plan or teach people to talk in the language of the plan, but rather the other way around, to kind of identify the gaps that in this language of planning, what that is relevant to you is getting missed out. And if you want to say that in planning, maybe just this terminology or this part of the process could be relevant, and how can we use that better? So I think just very strategically realizing what are the limitations of planning and trying to address that. And I think moving forward, one of the things with which MBD I think would need to look at is actually, from the beginning we have contested that this city scale of this extreme macro scale of the next 20 years is not the way, or not the scale at which these decisions should be taken. So how can we further push in the process towards zonal and local area planning, where hopefully more voices can be brought in?
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add to what Malavika said and what Champaka was saying. The provocation can also be that, do we really need a 20-year plan when the COVID has really shown us that, any sort of planning would have probably not prepared. Like the plan is coming out at a moment when we've seen mass migration outside of Delhi, that, you know, people left, then people have come back. So we're clearly not prepared. And the question really is to the Delhi Development Authority then, that in the middle of a pandemic, without really researching what are the kind of infrastructures that we need to build resilience, be it health, be it environment, that gets impacted during a global pandemic, do we then not take a pause and then sort of build a plan? And also to build a plan where we know that if there's anything that happens, like it can be floods in Bihar, in River Kosi, and I know that migration to Delhi would increase. So, you know, like these things, to a lot of sort of also say that do 20-year plans for a city as, you know, quickly evolving as Delhi, is it really required? And like what Champaka said, like, are we going to be able to only look at profits? The DDA, you know, for us to be able to go in for whatever little time they gave us, for us to say to them that, you know, 0.6% of Delhi's land is under informal settlements and 2% is parked under cars. You know, demolished 7,000 more homes than you've built recently. Is this the legacy? You know, I mean, these are civil servants. So we said, as civil servants, is this the legacy that you want to leave behind? So, but we'll see when the plan comes out, of course, how that is taken in. But of course, we plan to continue to struggle, you know, when the plan is out as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Lakhi di, aapke final thoughts? Okay, maybe she's not there. Rosario?
Yeah, I'm turning on my camera. Well, related with your second questions, I believe that generating this alliance that you were talking about is fundamental in order to promote our actions. In relation with community and legal empowerment, sometimes it's difficult to link with, for example, the academy, due to the challenge of being able to generate content that the neighbors can understand. Is an enormous challenge. And this is why we work so hard on academics, so that they can adapt their knowledge to the slums, but also to open up to learn everything that the neighbors know. And that's also a challenge. Once these actors like academics and professors understand that they do not have to give knowledge, but to exchange with neighbors, and to generate a space to in which those who knows shares with those who also knows, this change. And this is an enormous challenge. And in terms of scaling the strategy that you asked in your first question, I think I can say a lot of things, but I think that what COVID-19 taught us is that the key is to adapt our content and our strategies to the contextual need of the neighbors and the community. And this has to be the base for all our strategies and for all our ideas. To do things that community needs and not what we think that they need, and just to act in that way. So yeah, I will going to say only that.
Thanks so much, Rosario. I think that's really critical. Diana?
Thank you so much, Geetika. I hope I'm audible. So I think for me, the three questions came to mind, or three thoughts came to mind while you posed your question. The first one was, for us, we look at how can we translate local best practices into broader urban planning context within Kenya. So we're looking at policy, we're looking at practice, we're looking at resource allocation, and also capacity of duty bearers and key planning stakeholders. So then looking at how can we sort of upscale it to another level, where then this best practices that we see at the local level can be taken up and then can be also supported through policy and resource allocation. The second one is in terms of upscaling and looking for sustainability of these processes is continuously building a community of practice. So our idea is to really extend this kind of interventions and this work to more communities, so that then more communities are able to demonstrate. And this will also will go a lot in negotiating and bargaining with governments to upscale these processes. So once we have a community of practice, then we have community groups that are able to engage very intensively with the planning processes. The third one is looking at how to contextualize the resources and institutional structures of planning bodies. So, and by planning bodies, we're looking at the academic institutions, academic bodies, planning bodies themselves, like Institute of Planners. You know, how can they also contextualize the resources and the institutions that they have or that we have to sort of take up adaptive planning and use it as or mainstream it as a strong planning approach for creation of sustainable inclusionary communities. And this also includes integration with academia. Currently, what we are doing is that we're looking into having the academia sector and our communities and governments interact, so that we see then in what way can we influence curriculum, so that then the new groups or the new communities of planners that are being produced from universities are planners that are able to already engage and interact with existing urban dynamics. So based on lessons of this adaptive planning approach. So our approach is really looking at bringing together all these key stakeholders, CSOs who we will work with in advocacy, governments who will want to work with in uptake, and academia who we work with in terms of influencing curriculum in planning institutions. So those are the kinds of thoughts we are having in terms of how to upscale adaptive planning approach and how to use these best practices to influence how planning takes place within Kenya. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Champaka?
Thanks, Geetika. Very briefly, I just want to underscore again that businesses and firms are gated entities. They influence decision in strong ways in urban planning processes. It's important for us to shed our prejudices that the private sector is always evil. They're not always evil. So it's important for us to penetrate these spaces. But what I also want to underscore is that it's important for us to penetrate these spaces and make spaces for formal engagement between states and markets and states and businesses. There is no space in planning legislation for communities to participate, but at the same time, there is no space in planning legislation for businesses to participate either, to express their demands in transparent ways. So I'll end by saying that we must build formal transparent spaces for this state business demands to be made much more transparent.
Yeah, a lot happens in those opaque spaces actually. Lakhi di, aap ho abhi online? Maybe कुछ
हाँ, आवाज आ रही है?
हाँ जी अब आ रही है. कोई आपका फाइनल थॉट और फिर क्लोज करते हैं हम. थोड़ा सा काफी ओवर टाइम चले गए हैं. सॉरी टू एवरीवन बिकॉज़ वी आर रनिंग ओवर टाइम राइट नाउ.
मुझे लगता है कि जब हम शहर के विकास का कोई भी प्लान बनाते हैं ना, तो जिनके लिए बना रहे हैं उनकी भागीदारी को हम कैसे वहां पे सुनिश्चित कर सकते हैं, उस दिशा में सरकार और संगठन या एनजीओ सभी को सोचने की जरूरत है. हम जब भी, जैसे मान लीजिए कि अगर कोई प्लानिंग से जुड़ा हुआ इंस्टीट्यूशन है, तो उन्हें भी सिर्फ सरकार से बात नहीं, दोनों के बीच में एक ब्रिज का रोल वो कैसे निभाएंगे, इस दिशा में आनी चाहिए, क्योंकि ये बहुत बड़ा एक गैप है. मुझे शौचालय की जरूरत नहीं है, वो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट बोल रहा है आप जाइए शौचालय बनाइए, बस भाई आपको बनाना है. तो इस तरह का जो स्कीम्स है वो कहीं ना कहीं हमारे स्थिति को और ज्यादा बदतर बनाने की तरफ शायद बढ़ रही है. जो हम चाहते हैं उस दिशा में वो आ नहीं रहे हैं. तो कहीं ना कहीं अगर हम एक जस्ट सिटी की बात करते हैं, न्यायपूर्ण शहर की अगर बात करते हैं, तो हमारा जगह वहां पे होना होगा. तब हम कहीं ना कहीं जो राइट टू सिटी की बात है वहां पे उसको हम इंश्योर करने की दिशा में शायद कदम बढ़ा पाएंगे.
Cool. Thank you, Lakhi. And thank you so much to all the panelists for their contributions and thought-provoking sort of talks. And thank you to all the participants. I think some of you have also left. Thank you to them as well for your engagement. And really sorry to be over time. So I won't take more time to end this. So just a vote of thanks. And please join at 6:30 for the final plenary of today. And there is one more day of Urban Arc tomorrow. So please join the sessions. Thank you so much, everyone. And have a good evening, day, night, whichever time zone you are in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geetika.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.